The desert wind carried dust and tension through the abandoned village streets of Kandahar province. Specialist Maria Santos crouched behind a crumbling stone wall, her M320 grenade launcher attachment gleaming in the harsh Afghan sun. She had been in this position for 3 hours, watching the empty marketplace where intelligence reports suggested a high-value target would appear. Maria was not like the other soldiers in her unit. At 24, she had already completed 2 tours in Iraq and was halfway through her 3rd deployment, this time in Afghanistan. Her fellow soldiers called her Ice Queen because she never seemed rattled, never showed fear, and could make split-second decisions that saved lives. But today felt different. Something in the air made her uneasy. The radio crackled in her ear. Ghost 7, this is command. Target confirmed moving through Sector 4. Multiple hostiles accompanying. Proceed with extreme caution. The voice of Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was steady, but Maria could hear the underlying tension. This operation had been planned for weeks. The target was Ahmad Malik, a bomb maker responsible for 17 attacks on coalition forces. Maria adjusted her position and peered through her scope. The marketplace was still empty except for a few stray cats picking through garbage. She had grown up in East Los Angeles, where violence was common, but nothing had prepared her for the psychological weight of warfare. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every sound could be the last thing she heard. Her squad leader, Sergeant Thompson, was positioned 50 meters to her left with 2 other soldiers. They had worked together for 8 months, and she trusted him completely. Thompson was a veteran of 4 deployments and had a reputation for bringing his people home alive. He had taken Maria under his wing when she first arrived, teaching her the subtle art of staying alive in a war zone. The minutes stretched like hours. Maria's water was running low, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Her body armor felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and sweat stung her eyes despite the protective goggles. She thought about her sister Carmen back home, who was starting college next month. Carmen had begged her not to re-enlist, but Maria felt a responsibility to her unit and to the mission. A movement caught her eye. A man in traditional Afghan clothing appeared at the far end of the marketplace, walking casually but with purpose. Through her scope, Maria could see his face clearly. It was Ahmad Malik. Her heart rate increased, but her hands remained steady. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The target stopped at a fruit vendor's stall and began examining oranges as if he had all the time in the world. Maria knew this was likely a signal or a way to check if the area was clear. She whispered into her radio, "Command, positive identification on target. He's alone at the fruit stand, approximately 200 meters from my position." "Copy that, Ghost 7. Hold your position. Wait for additional hostiles to show themselves before engagement." Command's response was immediate and clear. They needed to capture as many of the network as possible. Maria watched as 3 more men appeared from different directions, all moving toward the marketplace. They were trying to look casual, but their movements were too coordinated, too purposeful. These were trained fighters, not ordinary villagers. She counted weapons partially concealed under their clothing. The situation was escalating exactly as intelligence had predicted. The radio buzzed again. "Ghost 7, we count 4 hostiles now in the area. Rules of engagement are approved. You have the green light for interdiction on my command." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's voice carried the weight of command, but Maria knew that in the next few minutes, life and death decisions would be hers to make. She steadied her breathing and prepared for what would become the most challenging moment of her military career. The enemy fighters were now grouped together near a tea shop, clearly planning their next move. Maria knew that within minutes, this quiet marketplace would become a battlefield, and everything she had learned about warfare would be put to the ultimate test. The explosion came without warning. A hidden improvised explosive device detonated near Sergeant Thompson's position, sending debris and smoke billowing across the marketplace. Maria's ears rang from the blast, and, for a moment, she couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched whine. Through the dust cloud, she saw Thompson's team scrambling for cover as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions. "Ghost 7, report status." Command's voice cut through the static in her earpiece. Maria quickly assessed the situation. The enemy had turned the tables completely. This wasn't an ambush by coalition forces anymore. They had walked into a carefully planned trap. Command were taking heavy fire from at least 6 positions. Thompson's team is pinned down. I count multiple muzzle flashes from the buildings surrounding the marketplace. Maria's training kicked in as she rapidly identified firing positions and possible escape routes. The enemy had prepared this location well, with overlapping fields of fire and multiple exit strategies. The targets they had come to capture were now hunting them. Ahmad Malik had disappeared in the initial chaos, but his fighters had taken defensive positions in buildings around the marketplace. They were using small windows and doorways as firing ports, making them extremely difficult to target accurately. Maria could see Sergeant Thompson dragging one of his soldiers, Private Johnson, behind a concrete barrier. Johnson appeared to be wounded, clutching his left shoulder while Thompson applied pressure to what looked like a significant wound. The other soldier in their team, Corporal Martinez, was laying down suppressive fire with his M249 light machine gun, but he was rapidly running low on ammunition. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. The enemy fighters were disciplined and well-equipped. They weren't spraying bullets randomly like untrained insurgents. These men moved with precision, coordinating their fire and maneuvering to improve their positions. Maria realized they were facing a much more dangerous enemy than intelligence had suggested. Her radio crackled with urgent communications from multiple units. All Ghost units, this is command. Air support is 15 minutes out. Medevac is standing by but cannot approach while the landing zone is hot. You need to suppress enemy fire and secure the area. 15 minutes might as well have been 15 hours. Maria could see that Thompson's position was becoming untenable. The concrete barrier that provided their cover was being steadily chipped away by concentrated rifle fire. Worse, she spotted 2 enemy fighters moving through the buildings to flank Thompson's position. In less than 2 minutes, they would have a clear shot at the wounded soldiers. Maria made a quick decision. She couldn't wait for air support or additional backup. Her fellow soldiers were in immediate danger, and she was in the best position to help them. She had trained extensively with the M320 grenade launcher, and she knew its capabilities better than almost anyone in her unit. The M320 was a powerful weapon, capable of firing high-explosive rounds accurately at targets up to 400 meters away. But it was also dangerous to use in close quarters where friendly forces might be affected by the blast. Maria would have to be extremely precise with her shots to suppress the enemy without endangering her own team. She identified her first target, a building where at least 2 enemy fighters were firing from a second-story window. The structure was old and appeared to be made of mud brick and concrete. A well-placed grenade round could neutralize that firing position and give Thompson's team a chance to move to better cover. Maria loaded a high-explosive round into the M320 and carefully calculated the range and trajectory. The weapon felt familiar in her hands. She had fired hundreds of training rounds and had used it successfully in previous engagements. But this shot had to be perfect. There would be no second chances. She steadied her breathing, acquired the target through her sights, and prepared to fire. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. The lives of her fellow soldiers depended on her accuracy and timing. Everything she had learned about warfare, about leadership, and about making life and death decisions was about to be tested in the most intense combat situation of her career. The enemy fire intensified, and Maria knew she was running out of time. Thompson's team couldn't hold their position much longer, and the flanking movement she had observed was almost in position. In the next few seconds, she would have to act decisively or watch her fellow soldiers die. Maria squeezed the trigger and felt the familiar kick of the M320 as the grenade round arced through the air toward its target. The explosion was tremendous, sending chunks of concrete and debris flying in all directions. The enemy fire from that position ceased immediately, and she could see dust and smoke pouring from the shattered window. "Nice shot, Ghost 7. Thompson's voice came through clearly on the radio. "That bought us some breathing room." Johnson is stable, but we need to move to a better position. But Maria's celebration was short-lived. The sound of her grenade launcher had given away her position, and now enemy fire was concentrated on her location. Bullets began striking the stone wall that provided her cover, sending sharp fragments of rock flying past her head. She had to move, and fast. Rolling to her left, Maria found a new position behind an abandoned vehicle about 20 meters from her original spot. The rusted truck provided better cover, but it also limited her field of view. She could hear Thompson's team moving across the marketplace, using the confusion from her successful shot to reach a more defensible position near a small mosque. Through the smoke and dust, Maria spotted something that made her blood run cold. A group of children, probably between 8 and 12 years old, had been hiding in one of the buildings during the firefight. Now they were running across the open marketplace, terrified and confused by the violence around them. They were running directly into the crossfire between coalition forces and the enemy fighters. Command, this is Ghost 7. We have civilians in the kill zone. Multiple children crossing the marketplace from east to west. All units hold fire, repeat, hold fire. Maria's voice was urgent as she watched the children stumble and fall in their panic to escape the battle. The temporary ceasefire gave the enemy fighters an opportunity to reposition. Maria could see muzzle flashes from new locations as they took advantage of the pause in coalition fire. The situation was becoming more complex and dangerous by the minute. Protecting innocent civilians while engaging a determined enemy required split-second decisions and perfect judgment. One of the children, a young girl wearing a bright blue dress, had fallen near the center of the marketplace. She appeared to be injured, possibly from debris from Maria's earlier grenade strike. The girl was crying and calling for her mother in Pashto, but she was too afraid or hurt to stand up and continue running. Maria watched in horror as two enemy fighters emerged from a building near the fallen child. They were moving quickly toward new firing positions, apparently unconcerned about the little girl lying directly in their path. One of them raised his rifle and aimed it toward Thompson's new position, while the other began setting up what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The tactical situation had become impossible. Maria couldn't fire without risking harm to the child, but if she didn't act immediately, the enemy fighters would have a clear shot at Thompson's team with devastating weapons. The RPG could kill or seriously wound all 3 soldiers in Thompson's group, including the already injured Private Johnson. Maria's mind raced through possible solutions. She could try to suppress the enemy fighters with rifle fire, but her M4 carbine didn't have the range or stopping power to be effective at this distance. She could wait for air support, but that was still 10 minutes away, and the situation would be over by then, one way or another. The young girl in the blue dress was still crying and trying to crawl toward the edge of the marketplace. Maria could see blood on the child's legs, and it was clear she couldn't stand or run. The enemy fighters were now less than 50 meters from her position, and they showed no signs of slowing down or acknowledging her presence. Maria realized that her M320 grenade launcher might be the only weapon capable of stopping the enemy fighters before they could engage Thompson's team with the RPG. But a grenade exploding anywhere near the injured child would almost certainly kill her. The blast radius of a high-explosive round was approximately 15 meters, and the little girl was well within that danger zone. For the first time in her military career, Maria felt genuinely uncertain about what to do. Every option seemed to lead to tragedy. If she fired, she might save her fellow soldiers but kill an innocent child. If she didn't fire, the enemy fighters would likely kill Thompson, Martinez, and Johnson, and probably target her position next. The weight of command responsibility that she had trained for, that she had thought she was prepared for, suddenly felt crushing. In training exercises, there were always clear good and bad choices. But, here, in the reality of combat, every choice seemed to carry an unacceptable cost. Time was running out. The enemy fighters were almost in position, and Maria could see the distinctive shape of the RPG being prepared for firing. She had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine who lived and who died in this dusty marketplace in Afghanistan. In that critical moment, Maria made a decision that went against every tactical manual and training protocol she had ever learned. Instead of raising her M320 to fire, she set the weapon down beside her and stood up from behind cover. With both hands raised high above her head, she stepped into the open marketplace where everyone could see her clearly. "Stop! There's a child," she shouted in Pashto, using the language skills she had acquired during her deployments. Her voice carried across the battlefield with surprising strength and authority. The effect was immediate and shocking. All gunfire ceased. The enemy fighters, who had been preparing to fire the RPG at Thompson's position, stopped and stared at this American soldier who had just walked into the middle of a firefight with her hands raised. They had never seen anything like it. Even Thompson and his team were frozen in amazement, watching their fellow soldier expose herself to almost certain death. Maria walked slowly toward the injured child, never taking her eyes off the enemy fighters. She continued speaking in Pashto, her words clear and steady despite the enormous risk she was taking. "The little girl is hurt. Let me help her. Then, we can continue fighting if you want." The two enemy fighters exchanged glances, clearly confused by this unprecedented situation. One of them, a bearded man in his 30s, lowered his rifle slightly and called out to Maria in accented English. "You are very brave, American woman. But also very stupid. Why do you risk your life for Afghan child?" Maria continued walking toward the girl, her movements slow and deliberate. She was now completely exposed, with no cover between herself and multiple enemy weapons. Any one of them could kill her instantly, but something in her calm demeanor seemed to create a strange protective bubble around the situation. "Because she's just a child," Maria replied, switching back to English so both sides could understand. "She didn't choose to be here. She doesn't deserve to die because we're fighting." The little girl in the blue dress had stopped crying and was looking up at Maria with wide, frightened eyes. Maria knelt beside her and quickly assessed her injuries. The child had cuts and scrapes from falling, and possibly a sprained ankle, but nothing life-threatening. Speaking softly in Pashto, Maria told the girl that everything would be okay. Sergeant Thompson's voice crackled urgently in her earpiece. "Ghost 7, what the hell are you doing? Get back to cover immediately. This is insane." But Maria ignored the radio. She carefully lifted the child in her arms, surprised by how light she felt. The girl wrapped her small arms around Maria's neck and whispered something in Pashto that sounded like "thank you." The bearded fighter who had spoken earlier took a step forward, his rifle still partially lowered. "You are not like other American soldiers we have fought," he said, his voice thoughtful. "They drop bombs from the sky and never look at the faces of the people they kill." Maria looked directly at him, still holding the injured child. "I look at faces every day. I see them in my dreams. I didn't become a soldier to hurt children. I became a soldier to protect them." For a long moment, the entire battlefield remained silent except for the distant sound of approaching helicopters. The air support that command had promised was finally arriving, but Maria knew that once those gunships opened fire, the strange ceasefire would end immediately and violently. The bearded fighter seemed to understand this as well. He looked toward his companion, then back at Maria. "You will take the child to safety?" "Yes," Maria replied without hesitation. "I give you my word as a soldier." The man nodded slowly, then did something that shocked everyone on the battlefield. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and began walking backward toward the building where his team had been positioned. His companion followed, still keeping the RPG ready but no longer aiming it at Thompson's position. Maria began walking toward the edge of the marketplace, carrying the child and moving as slowly as she had approached. Every step felt like an eternity. She could hear the helicopters getting closer, and she knew that once they arrived on scene, the temporary truce would collapse. Thompson and his team were ready to provide covering fire if the enemy fighters changed their minds, but, for now, the strange standoff continued. Maria reached the edge of the marketplace and handed the little girl to Corporal Martinez, who had moved forward to assist. As soon as the child was safe, Maria immediately returned to her combat position and raised her M320 again. The brief moment of humanity in the middle of warfare was over, and she was a soldier again. But something fundamental had changed. The enemy fighters had witnessed something they had never seen before: an American soldier who valued an Afghan child's life more than tactical advantage. The helicopters were now visible on the horizon, and Maria knew that within minutes, the marketplace would be under intense fire support. But, as she looked across at the building where the enemy fighters had taken position, she realized that the battlefield had been transformed by a single act of moral courage that had surprised everyone, including herself. The Apache helicopters arrived with a thunderous roar, their rotors churning up clouds of dust as they circled the marketplace. Maria expected immediate rocket fire and machine gun bursts to rain down on the enemy positions, but, instead, the pilots seemed to be waiting for orders. Command had apparently witnessed the entire standoff through drone surveillance and was uncertain how to proceed. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's voice came through clearly on all radio frequencies, including those the enemy might be monitoring. "All units, this is command. We observed the temporary ceasefire and civilian rescue. Enemy forces, you have 60 seconds to vacate the area before we resume combat operations." It was an unprecedented offer in Maria's experience. Military commanders typically didn't negotiate with enemy fighters or provide warnings before airstrikes. But Harrison had been watching the entire sequence of events and understood that something extraordinary had just occurred on his battlefield. From her position, Maria could see movement in the buildings where the enemy fighters were positioned. They appeared to be discussing their options quickly but without panic. The bearded fighter who had spoken with Maria emerged from a doorway and walked into the open marketplace, still carrying his rifle but with the muzzle pointed toward the ground. He looked up at the circling helicopters, then across at Maria's position. Raising his voice to carry over the sound of the rotors, he called out in English, "American soldier woman. You kept your promise about the child." Maria stood up again, though this time she kept her weapon ready. The strange dialogue that had begun in the middle of combat was continuing even with attack helicopters overhead. "I said I would keep her safe." The bearded fighter nodded and then did something that no one expected. He placed his rifle on the ground and raised both hands above his head. One by one, his companions emerged from the buildings and followed his example, laying down their weapons and surrendering. Thompson's voice was filled with disbelief as he radioed command. "Sir, the enemy fighters are surrendering. All weapons have been placed on the ground, and they appear to be giving themselves up voluntarily." The helicopters continued circling, but their weapons remained silent. Through her earpiece, Maria could hear intense radio chatter between command, the helicopter pilots, and higher headquarters. No one had protocols for this type of situation. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the confusion. "All ghost units, approach and secure the prisoners. Air support will provide overwatch. Ghost 7, outstanding work on the civilian rescue. We'll debrief this entire operation when you're back at base." As Thompson's team moved forward to secure the surrendered fighters, the bearded man looked directly at Maria. When she approached within talking distance, he spoke quietly so that only she could hear. "My name is Rahman. I have been fighting Americans for 3 years since you killed my brother in Helmand province. But today I saw something different. You risked everything for a child who was not your own, not your religion, not your country." He paused and looked at the little girl, who was being treated by a medic near the mosque. "Perhaps there can be another way besides killing." Maria studied his face carefully. This man had been her enemy just minutes before, someone she would have killed without hesitation if the situation had demanded it. But now she saw something she had rarely encountered in combat: genuine doubt about the righteousness of endless warfare. "What will happen to you now?" she asked. "I will be interrogated, imprisoned, maybe traded for other prisoners someday. But I have information about bomb makers, about weapons caches, about planned attacks. Maybe this information can save lives on both sides." Rahman glanced toward his surrendering fighters. "My men followed me into surrender because they trust my judgment. I hope your commanders are wise enough to understand what happened here today." The prisoner processing took several hours. During that time, Maria learned that Rahman had indeed been a mid-level commander with valuable intelligence about insurgent operations throughout the region. His voluntary surrender, influenced by witnessing Maria's protection of the Afghan child, led to information that prevented at least 3 major attacks on coalition forces over the following months. The little girl, whose name was Fatima, recovered fully from her minor injuries. Her father, who had been frantically searching for her during the battle, thanked Maria through a translator with tears in his eyes. The incident became legendary among both coalition forces and local villagers, demonstrating that even in the midst of warfare, individual acts of courage and humanity could change everything. 6 months later, Maria received the Bronze Star Medal for exceptional courage under fire, though the citation could never fully capture the complexity of what had actually occurred that day. She completed her deployment and returned home to California, where she struggled to explain to family and friends how a decision to put down her weapon had become the most important moment of her military career. Rahman was eventually released as part of a prisoner exchange program, and, according to intelligence reports, he became an advocate for peaceful resolution of conflicts in his home province. The story of the American soldier who chose to save an Afghan child rather than pursue tactical advantage became part of local folklore, passed down through families as an example of how enemies could choose humanity over hatred. Maria left the army after completing her 3rd deployment, but she never forgot the lesson learned in that dusty marketplace. Years later, working as a counselor for veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress, she would often tell the story of how sometimes the greatest act of courage is knowing when not to fight, and how a single moment of choosing compassion over conflict can change the course of many lives.